Joseph Perry was one of the first converts of Wright and Pollard in the opening weeks of the work in New Zealand. He was a fireman with the Dunedin Fire Brigade, and upon becoming a Salvation Army officer he was thrown right into the heat of the battle. He had to face roughs, he converted prostitutes, he took prisoners released from jail straight into his own home and looked after them. In 1884 he married Annie Lawrenson, and the following year in 1885 they were appointed to work in Australia.
As the depression of the 1890s bit hard, money raised by Perry's travelling limelight shows was used to help the social work of local Salvation Army centres. On Sunday evenings, lantern meetings focused on spiritual subjects. On 1 October evening in 1893, in outback Charters Towers, Queensland, the gas house lights failed. Perry then turned the beam of the lantern on several penitents kneeling at the front of the hall until they claimed salvation. By 1896, the location of Perry's lantern unit was a top-floor attic studio in the newly purchased Australasian headquarters, sited, significantly, a stone's throw from the front of Parliament House. When the Salvation Army marched, people, including politicians, would notice. That same year, the Salvation Army in Australasia acquired a new national commander, the founder's number 3 son, Herbert Booth. He was 34 years old and brought with him news that was to affect his future and that of Joe Perry quite profoundly. 1896 witnessed an invention that was to change the way we see the world. The cinematograph. Within a few months, Booth had acquired one for Joe Perry. When challenged on the use of such fiendish devices, Herbert responded in a familiar vein to his father, suggesting that the devil should not be the only one with access to the best of modern science. Over the next 3 years, the photo studio was extended with the addition of a glass-roofed film studio above the band room at the rear of the city temple. Here they began to produce short actuality films and even experiment with short story sequences based on lantern lectures. By 1900, with the Great Federation celebrations approaching, Herbert wished the Salvation Army to mark the event in a significant way. He chose to commission a new, purpose-built federal training garrison, situated just a few hundred metres the other side of Parliament House from headquarters. To help recruit cadets for the venture, he decided to produce a spectacular like none ever seen. On a wet night in September 1900, Herbert's vision was realised at the Melbourne Town Hall with the premiere of Soldiers of the Cross, the story of the early Christian martyrs. Conceived, written and directed by Herbert, with Joe Perry as producer and cinematographer, Soldiers of the Cross has gone down in cinema history as one of the earliest attempts at a full multimedia feature. It lasted for over 2 hours and was accompanied by a full choir and orchestra, with narration by Herbert himself. Such was its impact that the Melbourne Argus records women fainting in the aisles at the sight of Christians being torn apart by guns. Herbert next took the complete show to Sydney and then other cities, whilst his wife Cornelie had her own separate touring presentation in the slums of the great cities. The size of the touring parties for these shows also grew. This is one of the groups that spent several months touring in New Zealand. In the front row, sitting down, are 2 of Perry's sons. The technicians could double as a brass band or orchestra to suit the demands of the occasion. The tours became more sophisticated as limelight gave way to electric power. This is the top part only of the poster advertising the visit of the Chrono Biorama Company to Hobart. Other leading officers also became involved. William Peart was brought up on the goldfields and converted at Collingwood in the mid-80s. By the mid-90s, he was Chief Secretary to Herbert Booth. He wrote, presented and toured with the next major Biorama production, Under Southern Skies, a 2-hour documentary journey from First Fleet to Federation. George Carpenter was a talented writer and editor and a key member of Booth's team. Robert Sandel was a jack of all trades, a keen musician and writer, He also loved gadgets and became one of the principal cinematographers of the Limelight department. He was soon to get one of the most significant jobs in the nation's history. At this period, Australasia was going through one of the most critical and difficult experiences in its short history: the contentious debates over whether to federate into one nation. The colonies were divided. New Zealand opted out, Western Australia almost opted out, and the New South Wales Free Traders were virtually at war with the Victorian protectionists. There was little agreement, and on the first vote, the Commonwealth almost went down. Debates were far more acrimonious than the shouting match over an Australian republic. Yet in the midst of this, Herbert and the Salvation Army took a resolute stand in favour of federation. There was a headquarters in each colony, and one in New Zealand. Each colony used variations of the crest, yet over each crest the Salvation Army had a consistent banner spread: Advance Australasia. It even published cartoons in the war cry supporting the idea. This banner dominated the wall of the headquarters temple throughout the 1890s. This was no general sentiment. The Salvation Army's basis was scriptural. Booth's view was that as in Christ all are one, so Christianity was about reconciliation. And just as anything that divided people, whether it be racial, cultural, economic or political, should be opposed, similarly, those things that sought to bring the peoples of the world together should be supported. Whether or not it was this active support for federation that counted, a few weeks after the showing of Soldiers of the Cross, Booth and Perry received an invitation from the Government of New South Wales to participate in a very significant event: to become the official cinematographers of the birth of a nation. When on January the 1st, 1901, Herbert Booth took his place in an open carriage as part of the Grand Federation Parade, it was for a host of reasons that he doffed his cap to the camera, waved to the crowd and took the accolades of the Australian public. The Army was close to the centre of national life. Seated in the carriage with Booth you can see two other people. The one beside him is William Peart. The one with his back to the camera is someone I will mention again in a moment. Here's the grand plaster of Paris wedding cake pavilion in Centennial Park, and beside it the camera platform used by the Salvationists. And here is the film taken as the official party ascended the dais to sign the new nation into birth. The person cranking the handle of the cinematograph that recorded these images was Captain Robert Sandal. I referred to the other man in the carriage with Herbert and William Peart on that day. It's this chap here. Who is he? This man, Edward Saunders, the man who 21 years before stood beside John Gore on the back of that rough cart in Adelaide's Botanic Park and invited the hungry home for a meal. That generosity of spirit was returned many thousand-fold as Saunders passed through the cheering throng that day. When the first national census was taken in 1901, just 20 years after Barker's arrival, almost 1% of the Australian population claimed to be Salvationist. In New Zealand, the figure was 1.5%. What happened to the other participants in these vibrant years? In 1910, the Salvation Army closed its commercial film production business. Joe Perry and his sons all went on to careers within the Australian film industry. This photo is from the mid-1930s. Today, Joseph Perry is known to international film historians as the father of the Australian film industry.